Hello, everyone. We're just going to take a couple of seconds to allow the audience to enter the room. Thanks very much for joining us today. Okay, hello, everyone. Welcome to the EU Renew webinar series on Europe and the world. I'm Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I'll be your host and moderator today. Today, we are joined by Professor Dr. Wolfgang Weiß and Dr. Cornelia Furculiță, who will discuss their new book, Open Strategic Autonomy in EU Trade Policy, Assessing the Turn to Stronger Enforcement and More Robust Interest Representation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. Wolfgang Weiß is full professor and chairholder of public law, European law, and public international law at the German University of Administrative Sciences, Speyer. His main research areas are European Union, World Trade Organization, and international economic law. Dr. Cornelia Furculiță is an international lawyer focusing on international economic law. Her research and practice interests also cover EU common commercial policy. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Dr. Chad Damro. Chad is Professor of European Politics at the University of Edinburgh. Chad's research falls within the fields of international relations and international political economy, with particular emphases on international regulatory relations, transatlantic relations, and the European Union in international politics. Chad is also co-director of the Europa Institute and academic convener of the Futures Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Edinburgh. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Wolfgang and Cornelia of approximately 30 minutes, and then we will turn over to Chad to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking some questions, to which the authors will have an opportunity to respond first. And then we will go ahead and turn to questions from you, the audience. So please send those questions at any point during the webinar by using the webinar Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You should be able to see that at the bottom of the window. It says Q&A. That's best for sending in your questions. I will collect those questions to share with the speakers during the audience Q&A following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the EU Renew project. The EU Research Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of EU Renew, I would like to thank Wolfgang, Cornelia, and Chad for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor first to Wolfgang. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I welcome you as well. Welcome to the audience this afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting us and giving us the chance here to present our most recent book, which Cornelia and me, we wrote together. I will start with the presentation, just introducing you to the general idea and framework of the book. What was our research questions and how did we proceed with this issue? So the book analyzes the EU trade policy's turn towards a stronger enforcement and ensuring a level playing field. This turn was introduced by the European Commission's Trade Policy Review communication in February 2021 on an open, sustainable and assertive trade policy. At its core, the policy aims to balance the benefits of openness and multilateralism with a more forceful and self-reliant stance that includes strong enforcement mechanism and protection against unfair practices. So in this way, the European Union implements its motto of strategic autonomy into the area of trade policy. This trade redirection, as we call it, aspires to position the European Union as an autonomous actor capable of defending and asserting its economic interests. This trade policy redirection led to several new legislative instruments that gave the EU new tools to stronger enforce its trade rights and represent its interests more robustly. Our book deals with the concerns about the compatibility of such tools with international law, particularly WTO rules, and whether they represent a genuine defense against unfair practices. For the EU's tougher stance could be seen as a contradiction to its long-standing commitment to multilateralism and international law. Critics argue that the EU risks mimicking the power politics of the US and China. The European Union, however, defends its new stance as a legitimate, lawful response to the increasing weaponization of trade by others. The new policy framework is the product of a broader strategic evolution within the EU, which can be dated back to the 2016 EU Global Strategy. And with the Ursula von der Leyen's Commission taking a more geopolitical stance, the language of open strategic autonomy became central to trade policy. Historically, enforcement had not been a central topic of trade policy, but this has changed around 2012, 13 years ago. Enforcement since then gained traction, and so far we can remind you to the 2015 Trade for All strategy and the subsequent creation of the position of a chief trade enforcement officer that further signaled this shift, and now it then came in the full implementation with the advent of the new communication and the subsequent adoption of legislative acts. Let us have a quick through to the past of trade policy and how we assess the new turn. The European Union's trade policy has undergone a significant transformation from a liberal multilateral framework to one that emphasizes now strategic autonomy, assertiveness, enforcement. So in the words of Sophie Monnier, it's the end of naivety. Initially, as you know, the EU built its trade policy on multilateralism. The EU used its trade policy not only for economic purposes, but also as a vehicle to promote its values, social justice, environmental sustainability, human rights, reflecting the internal logic of the EU's own integration process. However, growing frustration with the slow progress of the WTO prompted a recalibration, and in 2006, that was the first step, the EU launched the Global Europe Strategy, which was a turn towards more bilateralism. And then, again, 2021, the advent of the open strategic autonomy marked a profound shift. This new trade policy review reflects the European Union's ambition to remain open to global trade while acquiring the capacity to protect its interests in an increasingly unpredictable global environment. The EU's economic resilience was to be increased. So this new trade policy review introduced a more assertive trade posture that connects trade with other EU priorities. And the EU new approach now blends multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral instruments. So while the EU still is committed to multilateralism, the EU now promotes a more adaptive version of it, described as networked multilateralism. Besides managing trade flows, trade policy also about managing power, values, and long-term autonomy. The drivers behind this new redirection and reorientation are, of course, key developments, such as the crisis of multilateralism and the systemic challenge posed by China. So, although the new trade policy does not represent a complete ideological rupture from past multilateralism, it significantly expands the EU's scope for autonomous action. It maintains continuity with past liberal and value-driven trade policies, but also introduces a pragmatic dimension that embraces enforcement, power projection, and strategic competition. The EU's former openness has been recalibrated into a more conditional model. And which are the constraints now and the confines for the new trade policy? Well, we find them, of course, in the foundational commitment of the European Union to multilateralism and international law. The EU continues to assert that all its actions under its new trade policy will be consistent with international law. The EU's multilateral commitment is constitutionally enshrined, and the EU is bound to respect international law, not only as a member of international law, as an international organization, but also due to constitutional foundations. The multilateral approach is deeply entrenched in the EU's DNA, also historically, institutionally, politically. Strategic autonomy in trade policy must therefore operate within these binding legal constraints, ensuring that multilateralism and respect for international law remain core normative pillars for EU external action and also for the new redirected trade policy. The EU's constitutional obligation to comply with international law resulted in the recognition of the primacy of international law over EU secondary legislation. However, the Court of Justice does not automatically invalidate EU acts conflicting with international agreements. Instead, it calls for a consistent interpretation. The obligation to respect international law is not absolute. It must be balanced against other constitutional principles of the European Union, as it coexists with objectives like safeguarding EU independence and promoting values such as peace, security, and open trade. So in case of conflict, a principle of practical concordance allows for balancing them. The Court of Justice has affirmed this discretionary balancing approach. A stricter constraint on international law stems from the Court's doctrine of the EU's autonomy, rooted in its institutional structure. This principle, developed to protect EU legal order's essential characteristics, is treated as absolute. But here, with regards to EU trade policy, it does not work as a strict barrier. It does not work as a barrier at all, because the doctrine on autonomy only protects essential characteristics of the EU legal order. So, the EU remains fully bound by international law. What are the consequences then? Well, the consequence is that even the new redirected trade policy has to be implemented in conformity with international law. And when you look to the international legal commitments, we see that there are four main categories of international obligations which become relevant: WTO law, bilateral trade agreements, general international rules, and special environmental treaties. New tools such as the anti-coercion instrument, the foreign subsidies regulation, or the amended trade enforcement regulation may risk violating rules on dispute settlement and non-discrimination. With regard to bilateral trade agreements, the EU must respect the dispute settlement provisions and the non-discrimination clauses contained therein. So tools like the amended trade enforcement regulation or the ECI could potentially bypass agreed upon mechanisms leading to treaty conflicts, and also the customary rules on countermeasures limit the EU scope for unilateral measures. So I only briefly allude to them because it's the second part of our presentation done by Cornelia, which goes into details here. So I will come to our conclusion for my part. The EU shift towards an assertive trade policy reflects both adaptation to global power shifts and a recalibration of its long-standing multilateral trade posture. This transformation marks a departure from passive liberalism toward a more interventionist approach. These instruments, the new instruments, may challenge WTO rules and other international obligations. The EU's reliance on public international law, irrespective of whether it is complied with or not, may not shield it from reputational damage and from retaliation by other states. So ultimately, the EU strategy hinges on its ability to assert power within the bounds of international law. Legal justification, institutional accountability, transparency are essential to maintaining both international and internal legitimacy. If successful, the EU could emerge as a normative leader in redefining fair, sustainable, rules-based trade. If not, it risks undermining the very multilateral order, which is already under severe contestation. Our book calls for a careful calibration between ambition and constraint, between power and strength, and legal confines. Thank you so much. That is the general proposition of our book. And now I turn over to Cornelia.
Thank you. Cornelia, you can go right ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see my slides. Yes, thank you everyone for joining. So in the next part of the presentation, as already said also by Professor Weiss, I will focus on the second and third part of the book that analyzes in more detail the tools that were designed to achieve the open strategic autonomy in EU trade policy, and namely the tools that ensure a better, a stronger enforcement of EU's trade policy rights, and also those that ensure that EU's interests are assertively represented, which the Commission also refers to as the tools ensuring a level playing field. So these are the tools that I will refer to in the following in the more detail. Firstly, looking into the tools for a stronger enforcement of trade rights. The first analyzed tool was the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement, which represents a temporary alternative arrangement for the appellate body stage under Article 25 of the DSU on arbitration. This arrangement ensures that during the appellate body crisis caused by the blockage of the appointment of the appellate body members by the US, signatures of this arrangement can still benefit from a two-stage dispute settlement mechanism. As the chapter shows, this arrangement is fully in line with the EU's international obligations, including Article 25 of the WTO's dispute settlement understanding conditions. The arrangement provides a system that largely replicates regular reviews, providing a certain degree of security and predictability to its signatures, and also introducing certain innovations that seemingly address the US concerns, thereby potentially helping to solve the current crisis. The arrangement does not provide the same degree of automaticity as the regular appellate reviews, as it only enshrines an intention of the parties to enter into arbitration agreements only once a dispute materializes, but still it is less likely that the signature that entered into this arrangement in the first place would be interested in not following it. The biggest risk that the arrangement entails is that it would become the permanent solution and not only a temporary alternative. But with no better alternative in sight, this multilateral, or rather plurilateral initiative should be commended, and the EU, as being the party that initiated it, should be applauded, and this initiative confirms EU's commitment to multilateralism. The second tool analyzed was the trade enforcement regulation, which was amended in 2021 to allow the imposition of unilateral countermeasure in case of uncooperative parties blocking dispute settlement procedures, be they multilateral, regional, or bilateral. These amendments clearly go against the requirement of Article 23 of the dispute settlement understanding, prohibiting unilateral measures without the dispute settlement body's authorization. And while the Commission tried to justify this countermeasures or potential countermeasures under general international law, namely Article 52.4 of the ILC draft articles that have a customary law status and allowing the imposition of countermeasure when a responsible party fails to cooperate in good faith in dispute settlement procedures. These are only general rules that have been displaced by the more special rules contained in the dispute settlement understanding Article 23, which should be the applicable ones. Even if this general rule would not be displaced, it is unlikely that WTO panels would apply it, since in practice WTO panels have never applied non-WTO law. And second, it would be difficult to accuse of bad faith other WTO members than the US, since they are merely using their right to appeal. So this is the violation, or is a potential violation of WTO rights, basically the procedural ones, but the trade enforcement regulation could also be in conflict with WTO and FTA substantive obligations, such as core MFN, or most favored nation treatment, or the national treatment. The following instrument that was analyzed is the anti-coercion instrument. This instrument probably illustrates the best the EU's trade policy turn towards geopolitics, and it allows, as a last resort, the imposition of countermeasures in case of economic coercion interfering with the EU's legitimate sovereign choices. The EU Commission argued this imposition in light of general customary international law rules, basically saying that the EU has the right to respond to violations of the international principle of non-intervention. However, it is not entirely clear if this customary principle covers economic coercion, and if it does, under which conditions. The Article 23 of the Dispute Settlement Understanding could be deemed respected, since, as I already said, the Commission argues that these countermeasures would respond to a general international law violation and not a WTO violation. But in practice, since the EU also intends to initiate WTO proceedings with respect to these actions, it is very likely that a violation of Article 23 would still be found. Also, the countermeasures listed in the Annex 1 of this instrument provide that certain obligations will not be followed, so there will be also substantive violation. The invocation of exceptions could be something to be considered. However, the chapter showed that the strict conditions established by these exceptions most likely would not be met by this instrument, so the application of this instrument should be done with utmost care. The final instrument, which is a bilateral one, refers to the enforcement of EU FTA's trade and sustainable development chapters. The new action plan provided by the EU extends the dispute settlement compliance stage to the FTA TSD chapters and introduces expressly the possibility to impose sanctions, although in strictly defined cases, such as the violation of ILO or core labor rights, and also the violation of obligations from Paris Agreement enshrined in the FTAs. Until 2022, EU's FTAs contained a cooperative approach, meaning that disputes were heard by a panel of experts that were making non-mandatory recommendation. The EU-Korea labor dispute that was conducted under this cooperative approach showed that it does not.
Thank you all for joining us today.
I'm sorry.
Please send your questions for the authors using Zoom's Q&A function.
Yeah, the approach does not lack teeth, but still, in case a party would not follow the recommendations of a panel, the EU might consider the imposition of sanctions. And if the FTA does not provide such right, the chapter showed that the residual application of customary rules on countermeasures would be unlikely. So this new action plan envisaged by the EU is in line with the public international law and would balance the open side with the strategic sign of the EU's desired autonomy, so it is to be commended. Next, going into the tools for an assertive representation of EU interests analysis and their compliance with international law. The first analyzed instrument under this part was the IPI regulation, the International Procurement Instrument, that allows the imposition of restrictive measures on non-covered procurement against companies from third countries that seriously and constantly restrict the access of EU economic operators to their procurement markets. Non-covered procurement, it means that this instrument applies only to procurement that is not covered by FTAs or the government procurement agreement under the WTO rules. So given the fact that the instrument could treat differently foreign products between themselves and domestic and foreign products, the IPI could violate multilateral national treatment and most favored nations obligations. And while the Commission seems to assume that these obligations would, however, be or that the procurement would not fall under this obligation, since they would benefit from a derogation on public procurement contained in GATT and GATS. The chapter showed that the derogation is narrower in scope than the IPI regulation, meaning that there could be cases in which the IPI regulation would still violate these core obligations. Therefore, the scope of the regulation should be refined. And while there could be potential exceptions, such as Article 24 GATT allowing in certain cases, deviation from the MFN obligation in case of FTAs, this exception would not be applicable in all the cases. The foreign subsidies regulation. This regulation enshrines the review procedures and commitments, redressive measures against undertakings operating in the EU that benefit from foreign subsidies. And you can here see a Chinese flag, because this regulation most likely was designed to address the approach of the Chinese state-led economy providing subsidies to its undertakings. Article 32.1 of the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures prohibits expressly measures against subsidies taken outside the agreement confines. Furthermore, Article 44.9 of the regulation prohibits expressly actions violating it. So the Commission should not act in case that its action would go against this article. But the chapter showed that there is certain overlap between the foreign subsidies regulation and the ACSM. Moreover, there could also be some potential national treatment violations contained in GATS and the government procurement agreements. So in practice, in order to comply with the requirement contained in Article 44.9 of the FSR, the regulation would in fact have a very narrow scope of application left if the Commission would also interpret the Article 32.1 as we did. So while certain justification again could be considered, it is unlikely that the regulation would comply with the strict requirements, given the fact that it treats the foreign subsidies differently compared to the EU state aid law. Finally, the foreign subsidies regulation could also comply with FTA rules that contain more detail and different procedures. So once again, utmost care should be taken in how this regulation is applied. The final mechanism, analyzed, that technically was labeled as a climate mechanism, that in fact also entails some implication with respect to ensuring a level playing field between foreign and EU products. The mechanism by imposing an obligation on importers of certain products to declare embedded emissions and purchase certificates upon importation. This mechanism potentially violates the common but differentiated responsibilities principle that requires the different treatment of countries situated differently, because the carbon border adjustment mechanism applies equally to all without accepting from its application even the least developed countries. But also it accepts from its application some of the countries that apply mechanisms similar to the ones in the EU. So because of that, the mechanism likely violates core WTO obligations such as national treatment or most favored nation, or even tariff commitments, depending on the way this mechanism could be classified. The mechanism could benefit from Article GATT exception, allowing actions that could help address the climate change. However, the EU should amend it in order to also take into consideration other regulatory measures of other countries, and should have first at least try to initiate multilateral discussions on the subject. Furthermore, FTA rules could contain even more detailed climate rules that could technically be violated by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So after reviewing the legality in light of international commitments of these instruments, each chapter of the book on the instruments also contain broader implication of these instruments. And here is a bird's eye view of their common broader implication. First of all, by engaging in unilateralism, the EU might invite others to emulate this behavior. It could undermine multilateralism by not respecting the multilateral rules. Moreover, while the EU tries to ensure that its products are treated fairly, in fact, it could lead to an escalation of the situation to a trade war from which EU undertakings would have only to lose. It could lead to internal politics, polemics about EU internal power division, since instruments such as the anti-coercion instrument deals with issues that traditionally concerned foreign policy. So that is why this could also lead to some discussions about power divisions within the EU. But this instrument could also lead to some positive implication, not only negative, such as incentivizing others to adopt more ambitious climate measures, prompting multilateral discussions on pressing issues, or deterring others' behavior that could harm EU companies, showing that EU is ready to act in order to defend itself. So it depends on how EU acts, if it manages to enhance the positive implications and fend off the negative ones. To conclude, the book showed that the tools are generally designed with an international law perspective in mind, since the EU Commission always tried to justify this instrument in light of international law, some instruments even contributing to EU's credibility as an actor committed to its international obligations, such as the MPI, where the new action plan towards a more assertive enforcement of FTA-TSD obligations. However, in order to ensure that the positive aspects are enhanced, the Commission should take utmost care to act within international law confines whenever there is a possibility to conflict with international law obligation. The book also suggested certain amendments to refine the scope of these tools to increase their likelihood of compliance with international law. So we're not suggesting that these instruments should be abandoned. They might be reviewed. And finally, the EU, whenever possible, should seek or attempt international dialogue to find multilateral or plurilateral solutions, and it could even use these tools to as a starting point for a discussion on reform, and these tools could eventually help, for example, with the WTO dispute settlement reform, or initiating discussions about multilateral rules on issues such as foreign subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. And now we will turn over to Chad for his reflections and some comments, and then we'll get back to the authors. Over to you, Chad.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. And thanks to the authors today, Professor Weiss and Dr. Furculiță. It's a great pleasure to be here to discuss the book, to kick off the discussions with some comments. Now, I guess for starters, obviously, this is a really timely topic. And so, as has already been highlighted in the comments that we just heard, and so my compliments to the authors for somehow anticipating when they started this project how timely these types of issues would be. I think we can all benefit from these insights because obviously by many accounts and measures, the global system is experiencing a lot of changes. You know, we talk about the rise of geopolitics or a geopolitical or geoeconomic turn. However we label it, you know, we're seeing a lot of governments and actors taking policies that we might think of as protectionist or more coercive, aimed at protecting national autonomy. And I think in many ways, the EU is it's a critical case for studying these types of changes and the policy tensions too that accompany these changes, because you have the EU as it's a significant global player. It's got a large interpenetrated economy, and it's dependent upon the openness of the international system for its competitiveness and its growth. But at the same time, it's initiating these types of policy responses designed to guard its autonomy. So I think it's important for us to look at the EU in this current context. And so thankfully, the authors of this book today don't shy away from this, you know, the big question that's related to these changes and the one that's on everybody's mind, right? And that, you know, what do these international changes and the EU's response to them mean for the EU's longstanding commitment to openness and multilateralism? And in fact, that really is my summary of the research question that they articulate in the book. And so I think what I'll do is I'll just share some thoughts and maybe a few questions that arose during my reading of the book. I think I'll try to stick to my allotted time. I'll be very careful because, as always with the EU webinars, there's probably lots of questions from the big audience out there. So I'll try to stick to the time, and I guess I'll begin with just a general comment. I'll reveal right from the outset that I've got a lot of positive feelings toward this book. I guess as an academic, I always go into reading a book, you know, you open it up looking and hoping to learn a lot about an interesting topic, and I can confirm that I definitely did that by reading this book. I think even more importantly, it got me really thinking about where we are at the moment, and what is in store in the future, and what needs to be done by and for the European Union in the future. And so, getting someone thinking is probably one of the higher compliments we can pay each other in academia. So thanks for that. There's a lot of other virtues in the book. I could go through chapter by chapter, but I'll just quickly kind of summarize a few of them. It's obviously, I think you can tell from the presentation already, this is a really significant project that reflects the considerable expertise of the two authors. It's well researched. There's a lot of empirical work that's gone in to the different instruments and the tools that Cornelia has just presented. And then they're all pulled together with some sharp analytical insights. And I found the material on EU trade policy that in some ways they could work as descriptive background material. But I thought that was absolutely essential, highly informative. Same goes for their discussion and their distinction between internal constraints and external constraints, these legal constraints. I think really helpful. And this leads me to suspect, I guess hope, that the book will be read as a resource by practitioners who are looking to remedy the inconsistencies that may arise between the EU legislative initiatives and its commitments in international and EU constitutional law. I know I will certainly keep it on my shelf, or I guess as an e-copy in my folder, to be, it's a resource to be used. It absolutely is. Thanks especially to those really useful empirical chapters as well. And the reason that it's such an important resource for practitioners and academics alike, I think, is because these tools are not going to be going away, right? In fact, the EU will probably be developing more types of tools in the future to deal with these types of changes. I also like the effort in the book to draw insights from other disciplines. In particular, there's political science, economics, international relations. A lot of that's woven into the discussions very helpfully. The discussions of open strategic autonomy's meaning and its relevance for trade policy, including the redirection in the trade policy review in 2021. From a methodological perspective, I welcome, it's a legal, interpretive, doctrinal approach, which I think is very helpfully elaborated in the book by the authors, and they justify it convincingly. It's an approach that I understand, and I value it for this type of a project in particular. I think it fits well with the research question and the objectives that the authors have set for themselves. And then there's also what I guess we could call it somewhat of a non-doctrinal approach to look at official documents and draft proposals and memoranda, specifically to explore the legislators' ideas and motivations. And I thought that was a really nice additional element to the approach that's being taken here. I guess this leads into a couple of thoughts or questions maybe that I had in this regard. If you could tell us maybe a bit more about how you determined which documents you were actually going to analyze. Is this a comprehensive analysis of the whole possible population of all the documents relevant for each one of these tools, or were there some selection criteria that you used to determine which ones were the most important documents from that large amount of documents that you could possibly look at? And similar then, I wonder, what are your thoughts? Would it make sense to look at some other types of documents? And I'm thinking like strategies, for example, the 2023 European Economic Security Strategy. Would looking at a document like that and how that document was developed, would that provide some more evidence for the legislators' ideas and motivations as the EU develops these types of tools? And then finally, I guess as an extension of this text-based analysis, I wonder if you'd consider or had considered looking at things like public speeches by relevant EU officials, which would perhaps give further context to the legislators' intentions. Now, as I said earlier, I think policymakers are going to find this book a really useful resource, especially thanks to the clear normative conclusions that'll be helpful in the future as policymakers try to navigate these uncertain times and how to respond to the challenges. And in that regard, I think the conclusions that you make are absolutely convincing. I think they're fair, and they certainly follow, which is very welcome, from the evidence that has been assembled throughout the book and that runs through all the chapters. So let me then maybe conclude with just a few final points that arise. And these are not criticisms by any means. Instead, they arise because I was stimulated again while reading the book. And not only reading the book, but thinking about the current state of the world. And so first, I wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on the extent to which your research helps shed light on the direction in which the EU has been trending since the 2021 trade policy review. Is there a general trend that you see here happening for the EU? You know, in other words, is the EU's response to the rise of geopolitics changing, right? Is it trending more toward what we might think of as coercion, despite the constitutional obligations that the EU has, right? And I appreciate this is maybe more of a political question than a legal question, but it'd be great to get your thoughts on that. And secondly, I mean, you note that there's a fine line between protecting one's own interests and engaging in protectionism. And I agree entirely with that. And then, you know, whether or not this line is crossed, at least partly depends upon the assessment of the reaction of the trade partners. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about, you know, I guess everyone on the webinar can probably anticipate where I'm going with this, right? But when we talk about EU's trade partners, you know, what are your thoughts about the, you know, the trade policies that are now being pursued by the US administration, right? This kind of this unilateral and more transactional approach seems very different from the EU's new tools, right? The US doesn't seem to be seeking dialogue before embracing an autonomous approach, So will this increase political pressure on the EU to engage in protectionism, right? Is it opening the possibility that maybe the EU will shift from being, right, I think what's mentioned in the book, from being a principled pragmatist to being something else, right? Maybe a more a pure pragmatist, right? Are these pressures something that you see as being material now? And then finally, you know, how does all of this current activity and maybe even some future activity by the EU and others, right? How does this play into the broader discussions of the demise or not of the rule of law in international relations? I think that's a big question. I think you have a fairly clear answer in the book, right? That such claims are probably exaggerated, right? But has your position changed maybe since the publication of the book? And so I'll just conclude by once again saying thank you very much for your book and for the presentation today. I see your analysis really as an excellent, a really useful contribution to what looks like an emerging research agenda across various disciplines on geopoliticization and economic security and strategic autonomy and open strategic autonomy. There's so much scholarly work that can be done on these topics in the coming years as part of this research agenda. And so your book is a great contribution to this agenda. I guess from that point of view, you know, we can look at these developments that are happening in the international system as being, you know, fortunate for us academics. We can study them, even though obviously the rise of geopolitics is not necessarily fortunate for the rest of the world. And so, of course, we go forward as academics with trepidation. We're interested, but we're also worried, right? And I think in that regard, we can learn a lot of lessons from your book. So thank you once again. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jed, for these questions and comments. We'll shortly turn over to Wolfgang and Cornelia for a response. But first, I just would like to remind the audience that you still have some time to submit any questions you have for the authors. And now we pass back over to the authors. I don't know who would like to go first.
You want to start, Cornelia?
Oh, yes, I can. So, yes, it's been more than one questions. I will try to briefly go through all of them. So regarding which documents to analyze, we try to go through all the preparatory work. So everything that was available, that is something that we consider, which is something that also would be taken into account as additional means of interpretation according to international law, so travaux préparatoires. So this is something that we took in mind. Regarding some other possible documents for public speeches of EU officials, I think in some respects we do refer to some of them, but of course not to not in many situations. I guess we took a more legal approach, considering this documents that are preparatory documents as having a more legal value according to international rules. Regarding the general direction of the EU's trade policy, I think it actually continues with the direction we described in the book. I don't think I changed my mind, for example, about that. It does try to seek a more geo-economic approach while still maintaining its support for multilateralism, at least on a declaratory basis. Whether it manages to do so or not, it is something that we're going to see in the future. Regarding being protecting its rights or being protectionism while US takes actions, of course it increased the possibility that the EU will act geopolitically, and we already see some developments in that respect, since the EU is probably or could probably use for the first time the anti-coercion instrument, which, as I said before, is the most concrete example of the EU's turn towards geopolitics, and how this instrument is going to be used, if it is going to be used, is a question. And whether this activity or how this activity plays within multilateral setting, and whether it helps or further erodes multilateralism, I think in general all unilateral actions do erode multilateralism, but as also said in the book, this particular moment could be crucial in showing support for the multilateralism, and perhaps this situation could lead to a favorable outcome and to the rebirth of the multilateralism. So if it is used as a chance or as an opportunity, it could turn to something good. So it will pretty much depend on how things will evolve in the future. And for now, I think, from my perspective, it's EU tries to portray itself as a multilateralism, but also tries to be geopolitical. Whether it manages or not to reconcile these two sides is still a question that is open.
Yeah, if I can add some ideas. When looking to the responses of the European Union since the last 2 years or so, when Trump returned to office, is not yet 1 year, but it makes one feel it has already been there for 2 years or so, because every day something new is going around the world. Well, we see, of course, a need that the European Union has some tools at hand. So there's so some observers say, and I would like to agree to that, the greatest success of tools like the anti-coercion instrument would be just to have it without the need to apply it. The mere presence of this tool might already demonstrate to our friends in China or in the US that, you see, we can respond to what you do. If you want to pay power politics, we can do that as well. So that is a very important thing. So this is even more important than the issue of whether this is fully compliant with international law or that or not. Yes, of course. I think that the EU still is approaching carefully. It's going forward carefully, so it tries to stick to the legal rules. The EU tries not to be too offensive to multilateral rules when applying its new tools, but still it tries to show and display that we have power which we could use. And of course, the new power politics by Trump has added to the need to come to terms with new bilateral agreements with trade partners like India, Indonesia, at a quick speed. And that is something actually which we can see now. And this is somehow a little bit of a redirection, that the Commission became more pragmatic now. When you look to what is in the pipeline now with regards to the ideas how we can come forward with a new trade agreement with India and Indonesia, which might be, of course, based on some watering down of some of the original ambition the Commission pursued.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions from the audience, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start with 3, and then we'll go from there and see if we have time for more. So first, I think we have one on the anti-coercion instrument. This one says that the WTO is not mentioned in the actual text of the anti-coercion instrument and only briefly in the preamble. The Commission also justifies the ACI based on states' rights under international law. So I have two questions here. Submitting a case to the WTO while undertaking an ACI is an option but not a requirement. So how would you explain your assertion that a WTO submission is required? And second, are you arguing that interpreting the GATT or WTO as part of international law is incorrect? The Commission's assumption is that it is part of international law. That's a first two-part question. Secondly, we have a question on whether there is a legal or normative tension between the environmental obligations set out in the trade and sustainable development chapters of EU trade agreements and the EU's unilateral extraterritorial measures to prevent carbon leakage, such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then a third question that's maybe a bit broader, looks at all of the tools you discussed, is whether the enforcement of the instruments you discussed could be improved, and if you have any suggestions for that going along the normative, some of your normative conclusions. We'll start with those.
Yeah, I think I will go with the first one. Indeed, the anti-coercion instrument does not mention the WTO, and that is for a good reason. As we said, it tries to portray the instrument as seeking redress for a violation of general public international law, and otherwise it would be in violation of Article 23. So also, this is a conclusion in the book that the EU did really put a lot of effort into making this instrument as looking as compliant with the WTO law. Our assertion is that despite the fact that the EU seems to portray this instrument as seeking a redress of a violation of a international law norm, in practice, it also mentioned that it is going to also initiate WTO disputes. So technically, in de facto, the EU admits that some of this behavior could also violate WTO law. And when it does so, and it also initiates WTO proceedings, we submit that in that case, it should better pursue the WTO proceedings, because otherwise it could be perceived as abusing its right and arguing that it is not a violation of a WTO law, while at the same time it initiates a WTO dispute showing that it is. So this behavior could be used as evidence of a violation of Article 23 of the DSU. So our assertion is not that WTO submission is required in general, but if the EU also intends to contest it as a behavior violating WTO law, then it better does so within the WTO law confines. Otherwise, it could use the anti-coercion instrument by itself. Whether we're arguing that the WTO rules should be interpreted in isolation of international law, no, definitely not. We agree that WTO law is entrenched within general international law. Our assertion was that the practice shows that WTO panels were very reluctant into actually applying general international law, not using it for the interpretative purpose. International law has been broadly used to interpret WTO rules, but it never happened that WTO panels applied non-WTO law as a justification for a WTO violation. So it is highly unlikely, unless the panels change their approach, that panels would say that this violation is justified by general public international law on countermeasures. So that was our assertion. Regarding the second question, whether there is a connection or contradiction between the environmental obligation in the TSD chapter and the CBAM. Yes, the book also says that FTA TSD chapters contain, for example, the express right to regulate of the countries. And the CBAM, on the other hand, recognizes only the regulatory mechanisms of other countries that are similar to its ETS system. And they also expressly say that this instrument is designed in a way to make others to adopt similar mechanisms. It here also you could make a reference to our third question, to the Brussels effect. So in that respect, there could be a conflict between these aspects. And also FTAs expressly enshrine the CBDR principle that I mentioned, the common but differentiated responsibility principles that countries probably would not have other venues to raise, but for example, they could do so within FTA procedures, since FTA norms, they incorporate this principle within the FTA. And yes, I basically also answered that, for example, the CBAM, we can see other instruments that are adopted by other countries emulating the EU actions. Professor Weiss, if you'd like to complete this answers, maybe.
Yeah, maybe to the last two ones. So when we look to the international responses, for example, with regards to foreign subsidies regulation, we see already that countries think about establishing something in the same way, just to have a tool at hand to respond, of course, to retaliate. So, of course, if the European Union says you subsidize your companies and this distorts the competition in the EU internal market, then, of course, the other have a good basis to say we now have also implemented such a rule, and now we do it the other way around. So EU companies subsidized by the EU funds or by state aid coming from the member states can be seen to distort the competition also abroad. So this might be as what I would call a negative Brussels effect, that they adopt the same policy but use it to go against, to counteract EU measures. So based on our research, how could enforcement be improved? Well, it could be improved, of course, if you are aware that countermeasures can come and that you have to comply with international legal rules which the EU entered into. For example, with regards to the foreign subsidies regulation, we have plenty of free trade agreements which also have some disciplines on subsidies, and they are very detailed, sometimes very detailed. Institutional provisions contain these EU FTAs, like, for example, with the United Kingdom, where we establish institutional rules. So the Britons could say, well, if you apply FSR against our companies, that is not in line with this UK trade and cooperation agreement. So that is really necessary, that we have a careful look at the bilateral commitments, that applying, for example, the FSR does not contradict to the specific provisions which we have in these bilateral issues, agreements.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all the time that we have for today, but thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks very much to the audience for these really interesting questions, and also to Chad for such great comments and reflections. Before leaving you, I would like to just share that this is the last webinar of the season, but we will be announcing our new season, our fall season, after a short summer break very soon on eu-renew.eu. So you can find our schedule there as usual in the coming weeks. And I really want to thank the authors for joining us today and for the excellent overview of their book, and to Chad for these great discussions, and to the audience. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day.
For
Thank you.
organizing. Thank you, Chad, for your wonderful comments, and thank you for all the questions that were posed by the audience.
We thank you very, very much.
Wonderful. On behalf of EU Renew, thanks for joining us today. Take care, everybody.
Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.